Good evening. Welcome to this fabulous setting. My name is Campbell Robb. I'm the Chief Executive of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And welcome to our fourth JRF Prospect Lecture. I'm not going to talk for too long because you're all here not to hear me, but hear our very special speaker, Alan Johnson. I thought it was worth just mentioning, for those of you who don't know, I've always loved this building. When you first come to London and you come to Westminster, you can't miss this building. But when you look into the history of it, it's quite a fascinating place. It is called, variously, but it's called the Million Guinea Hall. And the reason why it was when Wesley died. This is built in memory of John Wesley. When Wesley died, they wanted to build a memorial to him, but they wanted it to be because he was seen as a man of the people and he was someone who had transformed people's lives. They asked every Methodist and many others to give 1 guinea. In the hope that they would get it, and raised well over 1 million guineas. The first crowdsourcing, if you want to call it that, in 1890s, the power of the people, the power of poverty, and people who had nothing to give something to make a difference. And from that, this hall was built in the 1900s, and actually, I think, in the Second World War, also hosted Parliament when they were scared about bombing across the road. So this is a very powerful and meaningful place in discourse, and I like it as a building, so I always like to mention that. So you get a little bit of history with us as well. We're very, very pleased tonight to welcome you all. As I said, we've had a number of these lectures. I'm new to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, but I'm very pleased to be here tonight. And what we believe and what we've seen in the last couple of days in this election makes our belief at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and others even more profoundly strong, that what people are crying out for, what people are desperate for across the country, is a plan to help people to change their lives. For too long in this country, too many people, millions of people, have been struggling every day to keep a job, to get a job, to stay in a job, for that job to pay for all the things they need, to make tough choices between paying their rent or paying for their new shoes for their children. All of these choices, all of this struggle, and we don't see a comprehensive plan from any of the political parties which gives people that hope, that chance, that idea that their lives will get better and their children's lives will get better. That's what we read into this election. Thousands, millions of people saying enough is enough, but what we want isn't something different. We want new ideas, new thinking, new work to bring about a change in poverty. So that's what we're interested in. That's why we support this lecture, why we're so pleased to work with Prospect. So I'm going to hand over now, and I really hope you'll stay. We're going to really hear from an absolute hero of mine and a real sort of inspiration to all of us. It's going to be an absolutely great, I think I will use the word gig, because I think what we're going to get is a performance. Alan said he had his guitar with him, so if we all at the end ask really nicely, so we might get a song as well. But I'm going to hand over to Tom, who's going to take you through the rest of the evening. Thank you very much for your time.
Hello, and thanks very much indeed to all of you for coming. And it's a personal pleasure for me, as well as a kind of formal pleasure, to introduce Alan Johnson, who needs very little introduction, I think, with the profile he's built up over the last few years. He comes from, made his way from Southam Street in the west of London to the highest office in the land, from the Royal Mail van through to the leadership of the Postal Workers Union, and on to 5 cabinet positions, 2 of which I was lucky enough to work alongside him in. He has been, until this election, just this time, the MP for Hull West and Hessle, and he's now taken leave from that to concentrate on his full-time life of literary stardom. But it really is, in all seriousness, I think a great thing to have Alan here giving this JRF lecture, because Alan is one of the few people who has done the poverty thing from both sides, the public policy angle, but also the angle from having known very much what it's like at the sharp end. So what we're going to do is I'm going to step down and bring Alan onto the stage, and then when he's finished, I'll come back up and we'll have a panel discussion, and then there'll be a chance for questions. But for the moment, if you just give Alan a warm welcome, and I will try and get this computer off the lectern for him. Thanks very much.
Excuse us 1 second, there's a technical...
So, are they there? There.
That's it, okay. Thank you, Tom. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm off the whip tonight, so I don't have to worry about getting across to Parliament. But when I was asked to present this year's lecture, I was a Member of Parliament, and the next general election was 3 years away. The British people, having decided in 2015 to elect a Conservative government with a small majority for a 5-year fixed term, have just been asked to decide again. So Theresa May is obviously a convert to repeat referendums. As a result, the small majority has vanished, and as for a 5-year term, there is some doubt as to whether this government will last 5 weeks. You'll recall that when she stood outside number 10 to surprise the nation by calling a snap election, Mrs May made the ludicrous comment that the country was united, but Westminster was divided. Now, just about the only thing that unites the country is the low regard in which our Prime Minister is held. Westminster, as you may have noticed, is designed to be disunited. The only difference now is that Theresa May's team, as the Conservative Party was temporarily renamed, has fewer seats. I decided not to fight this election in order to spend more time with my family, having checked carefully that they were prepared to spend more time with me. But as a result, I had very little involvement in the election other than as an interested observer. And it was in this capacity that I was left baffled and disturbed by the absence of any real focus on the rising levels of poverty caused by the most brutal cut in benefits since the creation of the welfare state. Overall poverty, which hit 12.5 million in the 1980s and 14 million in the mid-90s before going into decline under Labour, is now set to reach a new high this year, rising to over 15 million by 2022. According to the House of Commons Library, these overall trends mask striking differences between age groups. The proportion of pensioners in poverty is much lower now than during the 1960s, when consistent data began to be collected. But the poverty rates for children and working-age adults are higher than they were 50 years ago. This year, inflation, as we've heard today, is set to hit 3%, but the freeze on working-age benefits will continue and would probably not have been unfrozen to any great degree if Jeremy Corbyn had become Prime Minister. In essence, therefore, whilst the focus was on threats to pensioners' income, both main political parties in the election supported a real terms pay cut for the working-age poor. As Gordon Brown has recently pointed out, despite a 35% rise in prices this decade, child benefit will have increased by only 2%. Housing benefit no longer covers the rent. Heating allowances fail to meet the cost of fuel, and crisis loans that used to provide emergency access to cookers or beds have been comprehensively shredded. With wages stagnant, the just about managing are soon to be the just about sinking, yet their predicament barely figured in the election beyond platitudinous references to the need for fairness. Whilst concern for the poor is commonly expressed, taking measures to improve their condition has rarely been seen as a recipe for winning a general election. This is largely because of the scandalous misrepresentation of poverty as being some kind of lifestyle choice. This artifice reached a new and disgraceful zenith under the Cameron-Osborne regime. The poor are powerless to fight back against this propaganda. Being poor means being powerless. Individually, the poor don't wish to be defined by their poverty, and collectively, there is no solidarity amongst the impoverished. no national union of poor workers. And if you want a very recent example of that, you can see in the Labour manifesto where the Labour Party pledged to abolishing university tuition fees. Now remember, this is for graduates, not students. Their student maintenance loan and their fees are rolled up. They pay nothing until they're earning more than 21,000. Then they earn 9% of the difference between the threshold, 21,000, and what they're actually earning. So someone on 24,000 a year, a graduate, will pay the grand total of just over £5 a week, the price of a pint. But we would not, committing to 11 billion on that, we would not commit to lifting the freeze on benefits and restoring their value, the cost of which would have been about the same. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation has spent more than a century seeking to understand the root causes of poverty, to better construct policies for its alleviation and eventual eradication. I doubt if I was asked to deliver this lecture because of my academic prowess in the field of sociology. It's more likely that I received this very welcome invitation because of my personal experience of poverty. That qualification confers on me no greater authority or expertise. You don't have to have been poor to understand the causes of poverty or to care about its eradication. Indeed, in my experience, some of those who have exchanged rags for riches become the severest critics of those they left behind. What it does confer on me is the ability to speak from lived experience. Here are 3 quotes about poverty, each of which has a personal link. The first because it's by my namesake, Samuel Johnson, who in a letter to Boswell gave this piece of advice: resolve not to be poor. Whatever you have, spend less. Poverty is a great enemy to human happiness. It certainly destroys liberty, and it makes some virtues impracticable and others extremely difficult. That was Johnson in the 18th century. And now here's the poet Philip Larkin in the 20th century, looking down from one of the upper floors of Hull Royal Infirmary in what was until recently my constituency, onto the slums below that had yet to be cleared. And writing that this place was where kids chalk games and girls with hairdos fetch their separates from the cleaners. O world, your loves, your chances are beyond the stretch of anyone from here. My final quote is from a nameless man who I describe in my childhood memoir, This Boy, available at all good bookshops, $7.99. I describe him as the real mod. I met him just once when he came to our house with a bunch of my older sister's friends, but it was he who related the philosophy of the 1960s West London mod. You may be poor, he cautioned, but don't show poor. I find these quotes instructive because Dr. Johnson suggested that being poor was something a person could choose to be and therefore be careful to avoid, whilst Larkin, whose poetry I love, seems to be sneering at working class culture rather than railing against the conditions in which some working class people lived. As for the real mod, there was a defiance in his advice to me which epitomised the social revolution of the 1960s, when working class musicians, actors, models and photographers set out to prove that the world's loves and chances were not beyond the stretch of anyone from here. This is the point at which we need to differentiate between social class and economic status. Whilst not all the working class are poor, it is invariably the case that the poor are working class. The pictures behind me, if I press this, and then I'm not sure what to press to get the other ones, but there you go. They're by the great photojournalist Roger Main, who came to our street, Southam Street, North Kensington, London, West 10, and took the photographs for which he is most famous. They capture the conditions I was born into and the street where I spent the first 9 years of my life. They've been the subject of numerous exhibitions, most recently at the Photographers Gallery just off Oxford Street. What you see is the crumbling exterior of houses never well built in the first place, which were condemned as unfit for human habitation in the 1930s, 25 years before these photographs were taken, of humans still inhabiting houses in conditions that Dickens would have been familiar with. Mayne's camera never strayed inside to record the damp, the squalor, and the horrendous overcrowding, which forced so many people onto the streets. Being outside was an infinitely better option than being inside, even in winter. Roger Mayne captures the vibrancy of street life, but thinking back and re-examining this photographic record of my youth, I'm struck by one simple fact. Whilst everybody in these photographs lived in appalling conditions, they weren't all poor, either relatively or absolutely. Mr. Bishop, who lived on the first floor at 123 Southam Street, worked for the gas board, earning a good wage. Mr. Hughes, round the corner, became the first person we knew to own a car. This was certainly a working class community, but it wasn't collectively in poverty. The people in these photographs would soon be dispersed to the suburbs. Had Roger Mayne's camera followed them to the new housing estates of Basingstoke or Welwyn Garden City, or where I went to eventually, the Britwell estate in Slough, his photographs would have recorded the same families, but against the backdrop of well-built modern housing with front and back gardens, an indoor toilet, and luxury of luxuries, a proper fixed enamel-coated bath. The photographs wouldn't be as striking and the link to poverty not as pronounced. Of course, living in this kind of degradation was a stark form of deprivation, but my family, my mother, my sister and me, felt no shame about our housing conditions because everybody around us lived in similar circumstances. But we were ashamed of our poverty, about pretending we weren't at home when the man from the Prue came to collect the instalments my mother couldn't pay, about asking the grocer, Mr. Berriman, in the corner shop, if we could have the goods he'd just carefully packed for us on tick, thus providing us with an early version of a food bank, albeit with a mounting debt. About having to announce to the class that we were on free school meals, sir, when the teacher called out the names of his charges in alphabetical order so that they could walk to his desk and pay their dinner money. About having our gas and electric cut off because the bills weren't paid. So the stigma attached to poverty was as strong in our working class community as anywhere else. And the accident of birth, which placed us into these terrible conditions, didn't mysteriously rob us of the desire to improve our lives, as Larkin suggested. Neither did it breed envy. My sister and I were appalled to hear that the prosperous families my mother cleaned for at the Holland Park end of the Portobello Road sent their children to boarding school from a very young age. That, to my sister and me, would have qualified as true deprivation had we known such a term existed. For Larkin, looking down literally and metaphorically onto the slums of West Hull, it is the culture that he appears to bemoan, the girls with their hair in rollers, getting ready for a night out, the children chalking out a hopscotch grid. It's an attitude that in some parts of society transferred a healthier abhorrence of the slums to a less understandable distaste for the council estates that replaced them. Dr. Johnson was correct. Poverty is the great enemy to human happiness. But for us, resolving not to be poor, as he urged Boswell to do, would have been futile. It would have been like resolving not to be cold in the winter. For our mother, living in damp conditions with a serious heart condition and having to scrub and clean for other people in order to feed us, poverty was more than an enemy to her happiness. It was a death sentence. She was part of a generation that was grateful for the advances made in society, even if they couldn't be the full beneficiaries. Votes for women and the creation of the NHS happened in her lifetime, but so did the Second World War. These photographs capture the gradual process that's underway by the mid-50s, the evolutionary effect that visionaries like Rowntree and Beveridge are having on society. The middle-aged men and women looking older than their years, stoical, resigned, not expecting to live much beyond retirement age. The teenagers, gaunt but confident, forging their own culture in a society where full employment had been embedded. And the children, inoculated against the diseases that once would have threatened their lives and enjoying the opportunities of the Butler Education Act, the Beveridge Report and the Attlee government. Three men, a Conservative, a Liberal and a Socialist, who established the foundations for the brave new world of post-war Britain. Most of the children in these photographs would go on to experience the liberation of the 60s, the social mobility of the 70s, the home-owning 80s and the pension-accruing 90s, right up to their freedom pass-wielding, triple-locked retirement today. My generation was fortunate compared to the ones that preceded it, and if we're not careful, the generations to come. As politicians debate what needs to be done, there is a tendency to focus on what might work in the future rather than refining and resourcing what has worked in the past. We look for new solutions while those that are tried and tested rust in a scrapyard of previous initiatives, condemned because they cannot be described as fresh thinking or because, in the language of political tribalism, they were not invented here. Some old ideas eventually managed to take root. The national minimum wage is one of them, a policy championed by Keir Hardie as a founding principle of the Labour Party, but which was opposed by the TUC in the 70s and the Conservative Party until the end of the 20th century. Its introduction via the Low Pay Commission was necessarily careful and gradual, but it's now a fundamental bedrock of the fight against poverty. It is, in effect, part of a modern welfare state, which demonstrated its importance during the aftermath of the collapse of Lehman Brothers. As Tom Clarke, my very good friend and the editor of Prospect magazine, has pointed out, when the crash of 2008 happened, the welfare system, created by Attlee and supplemented by subsequent governments, came into its own. Although more GDP vanished than in any previous post-war slump, inequality didn't immediately increase. Indeed, for a brief period, it actually fell. Far fewer jobs were lost, and not as many evictions occurred than in the more modest dip of the 1990s. Crime, which had increased dramatically in all previous recessions, carried on falling. That's largely because the automatic stabilizers kicked in, maintaining spending power in recession-lashed communities. But there was an important addition. As well as payment for the temporarily unemployed and child benefit, there was now the tax credit system to top up shrinking pay and bespoke tweaks to income support to help jobless families to pay the mortgage. The government of Gordon Brown, and for a short period the coalition, notched up benefits in line with inflation, the formula accepted by governments of all political persuasions for as long as anybody could remember. The response to this demonstrable success of a system built and improved by successive governments was to begin to dismantle it. Prosperous politicians disgracefully traduced the poor as people living in households where the blinds stayed down in the early morning while their neighbours went off to work. Television programmes like Benefit Street began to portray the welfare state not as a means of overcoming the problems caused by the banks, but as a problem in itself. On the left, we began to explore the idea of introducing a universal basic income, apparently oblivious to the fact that tax credits were introduced specifically to provide a secure stream of income for families with children, whether in or out of work, the principal attribute claimed for UBI by its advocates. Why don't we resolve to ensure this works properly before looking for solutions in the expensive world of fantasy politics? As always, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation is a haven of good sense and muscular practicality. They published a long-term plan to eradicate poverty last September, and its 5 points are fully grounded in reality. Point 1 is to boost incomes and reduce costs by investing in our infrastructure. They give the example of building 80,000 genuinely affordable homes to rent and buy in England every year. Point 2 is to deliver an effective benefit system which reverses cuts to the work allowance under universal credit, setting it at a level that provides a decent safety net. Point 3 is to improve education standards and raise skills, closing the attainment gap and giving 5 million adults who lack basic reading, writing and literacy and numeracy skills the training they need. Point 4 is to strengthen families and communities by building a family hub in every area so parents and families can access parenting support. Perhaps we should call them Sure Start centres. Point 5 is to promote long-term and inclusive growth through genuine devolution, giving mayors and council leaders the powers, incentives and budgets to generate growth that reaches everyone in their boroughs. The aim of the plan is to give every child who started school last September a chance to grow up in a more prosperous and poverty-free UK by 2030, a country where no one is destitute, fewer than 1 in 10 live in poverty at any one time, and no one lives in poverty for more than 2 years. This policy is comfortably situated in the land of the achievable, recognising that if we record the incremental advances of progressive politics, we'll know what works and therefore what we need to do more of. Society has improved dramatically since Roger Main took those photographs. I have no nostalgia for some mythical golden age of the past. The 50s was to me a brutal decade. I saw those signs in shop windows advertising rooms to let, no dogs, no Irish, no blacks. Lived through those happy days when domestic violence was rife and went unchallenged. The days when married women weren't allowed to rent a telly or buy something on hire purchase without their husband being present to countersign the paperwork. The era when a war hero such as Alan Turing could be chemically castrated by the state for being homosexual. A time when only a tiny elite of young people, 2% when I was born, were given access to higher education. The horrendous conditions of Southam Street and its equivalents across the country had almost entirely been swept away by the late 1960s, early 70s. But today a new housing crisis is affecting the children and grandchildren of those populating Roger Main's photographs. And the rising living standards that we baby boomers enjoyed have been in reverse for almost 10 years. I've always believed that the Labour Party has 2 simple objectives: greater equality and the eradication of poverty. All policies should be means towards those ends, which is why, as well as adopting the splendid JRF 5-point plan, I want government to get serious about tackling health inequalities. We have long passed the point where even the concept of health inequalities was politically contentious. Indeed, Theresa May chose to place tackling them at the centre of her very first utterances as our Prime Minister, when she pledged to fight against, and I quote, the burning injustice that if you're poor, you will die an average 9 years earlier than others. The social determinants of health through which those obscene statistics can be measured and scientifically addressed have very little to do with the health service. They are predominantly affected by housing, education, employment opportunities, and of course, income. It is because of this diversity of causation that the issue often becomes lost in a confusion of ministerial departments. Tackling health inequalities is where the eradication of poverty and greater equality assume a scientific as well as political form. To succeed, it needs to be adopted as a prime ministerial responsibility with its own cabinet committee. These are dangerous and uncertain times for everyone, but for the poorest in our society, as always, the difficulties and dangers are magnified. I'm reminded of the words of R.H. Tawney, who said this: "The goodness we have reached is a house built on piles, driven into black slime, and always slipping down into it unless we are building night and day. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation has never stopped building out of the slime. It's time for the rest of us to lend a hand. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan. There's so much in that. It's quite hard to know where to start. I'm just going to put those photos back up because they're rather frustratingly coming and going. You know, there's policy questions in there. There are interesting personal questions in there, and I know that there'll be a chance for people to get your books at the end and talk to you about that aspect. But I did think you're a big political figure, and we're sort of a day or two out from a rather surprising election. So before we widen the panel discussion, which I'll do in a minute, I just wondered whether you had anything to say on the connection between these kind of this agenda and the striking success and unexpected success of Labour in putting on 10 percentage points. Could you picked holes in parts of the Labour manifesto in terms of it's not undoing the full benefit freeze, but could it be a sign that actually people have had enough of austerity and the poverty that goes with it?
Well, I think it definitely is. I think a number of things have changed since last Thursday. You know, we won a seat that we've never held before, Canterbury, and we lost a seat that we've always held, Mansfield. It's very difficult to see how Theresa May can carry on for very long. I mean, I wasn't being unnecessarily sarcastic when I said it's questionable whether it will last for 5 weeks. But the feeling is, of course people have had enough of austerity. It was one thing to be told, if you're a public sector worker, your pay is being frozen for a year because we need to get the deficit down, even to be told for 2 years or 3 years. It's now been 7 years with every sign it's going to be for the next 10 years. People are not stupid. They're not going to use this, they're not going to let the government use this excuse as a way to drive down public services, which was the aim of some on the Conservative benches. So I think that is a factor. And there were a lot of good things in the Labour Party manifesto, obviously, that address this. The end of the bedroom tax, the issues about the cuts that were due to come. Only a third of Osborne's cuts when he was doing the budget from 2 years ago have been implemented. The rest are in the pipeline. So cancelling some of those. But it seems to me that issue, the reason why I drew the comparison of £11 billion is that for the very poorest, at the very bottom of the pile, it seems to me that they have to be a priority. Nye Bevan said socialism is the language of priorities. They have to be the priority if we're going to tackle the huge issues that Jeremy Corbyn and others have been talking about. I don't think that's going to happen, incidentally, from Theresa May. I hope on health inequalities that her words that she said on the steps of Downing Street produce a more tangible form in government, some aspect of policy. But I can't see any sign of it at the moment.
Thank you very much, Alan. Now, let me bring in our other panellists here who we're delighted to have. So we've got Campbell Robb, who you've already met, who's the Chief Executive of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and also particularly pertinently here, I think, given some of these images and some of what's been in Alan's talk, the Chief Executive for a number of years before that of Shelter, the housing charity. And we've also got Dame Carol Black, whose CV, it's fair to say, completely defies any easy summary, but she is now the principal of Newnham College, Cambridge. She has been the president in the past of the Royal College of Physicians and is really one of the country's leading experts in that important gap between work on the one hand and health on the other. So both of these people superbly well qualified to enrich the discussion. And we've also got a lot of very distinguished people in the audience. So I think rather than have a long panel discussion up here, I'd like to just ask one question each of these two while you're gathering your thoughts, maybe about things that you might like to ask them, and then we'll bring people in for Alan and for the other two as well. So, Dame Carol, the question I was going to ask you is, we keep hearing, and I think it's true really, but by any reasonable measure, the British jobs market is something of a success. Employment's quite high. It never went all that low during the recession, and yet we know we've also got these hideous health inequalities. Sitting as you do in between work and health, why is it that we've got so much of the sickness of poverty being evident when work is meant to be the great route out of poverty, and we've got quite a lot of work?
I think it's probable that our masters have not really ever understood the social determinants of health. Of course, they should do, because Michael, and I think he's sitting there, Michael Marmot wrote so eloquently about it in 2010. And I had a light bulb moment, actually, when I was president of the Royal College of Physicians. I thought it was enough to be a really good diagnostician and really able to treat people. But never once during my clinical career did I ever say to anyone who walked into my clinic who had not got a job, why are you not in work? Would you like to work? And what can I do to help you? So I'd like to suggest to you, I was a pretty ineffective holistic doctor because I was really along the lines of science, but what really mattered was to treat them as a human being with a functional capacity. So I think my own profession and healthcare professionals have quite a lot to answer for in this agenda. And I think you have to remember, for people in poverty, and I've recently done a report, well, it was commissioned by Cameron and then published under the Conservative administration of Theresa May, on those people who sit in our benefit system who are addicted to either drugs or alcohol. You have to understand what it takes for someone who is in poverty, physically not well, poorly educated, with no social circle and no housing, and deconditioned. And by that I mean not able to get up for 9 o'clock in the morning to be at work, not used to work, so they get tired. You have to think about what would you do to make that journey different. It isn't a quick fix. And I think one of the problems of the work program, which was intended to help people who were really in our benefit system, almost certainly many of them living in considerable poverty, but it was so easy to take the low-hanging fruit. I mean, what I've been trying to do for 10 years, that's obviously not with a huge success, is to persuade governments of any colour, could you please stop people falling out of work? Could you attend to those things which would support them and enable them to be in work? And then, as soon as someone is entering our benefit system, could you take a serious look at why they're in this place? Don't let them live for years on ESA with no support, no way of getting back. That journey from work into poverty, and of course there are the people who perhaps never had the opportunity to work, is an awful one, and I believe could be prevented. I'll just give you one example of a wonderful company up in Northumbria, Port of Blythe, 100 dockers, and I was giving them a prize for being one of the best SMEs in a particular competition. But I tell you the story about these men because it chimes with what Alan has just said. Their new CEO thought they were pretty unfit. There was a lot of sickness, absence, a lot of turnover of staff, and he thought, quite genuinely, they should have better canteen food, and they should have a bicycle scheme, and he was willing to provide reduced gym membership. He never once asked them what they wanted. And what they wanted was some of the things Alan has talked about. Many of them couldn't read and write. They wanted numeracy, they wanted literacy, and they wanted skills. And it was then that they were prepared to think about their more physical health, to think about perhaps they were smoking too much. They weren't eating the very best things. But you have to deal with the most basic things first. And I think that was a very, very good example of being able to be in tune. These men, of course, did have jobs, but my goodness, it was easy for them to lose their jobs fairly early in life, in their early 50s, because they were no longer physically able to do the work. And that was partly because the sort of public health part of the determinants of health had not been looked after.
Could I just push you a little bit on the sort of type of work question? Because there's lots of parts of the community where employment rates are still very, very low. You know, one could think of Bangladeshi women, for example, people with certain types of disability, and some of them you've talked about. But overall, employment levels aren't so bad. What's the effect on health if someone has got a job, but maybe it's a very insecure job? Because one senses this is becoming maybe as big an issue almost as the workless poverty.
Well, you're really talking about what is good work and what is a good workplace. And I am not at all trying to say that any old job is good, because there's good evidence from research in Australia that if you have a job of very low psychosocial quality, then in fact your mental health is probably better in the benefit system than it is in a very bad job. But good work for me is one you have security and safety in your work. It's truly important. Do you have some sense of autonomy? Is there some sense of control for you? Is there some flexibility? Are you listened to? Are you given training opportunities? It's not necessarily just how much you are earning. And if we cannot, perhaps at the moment, easily improve the financial rewards to someone in a job, then the least we could do is to make that job a good job or a better job. Of course, that's not the complete answer. And a good workplace is where the head of the workplace, the CEO, actually shows, I don't mean tick a box, that they care about the health and well-being of their staff. They're visible, they participate. I always say a board member or a member of a council, whichever is the governing body, should have as part of their responsibilities the health and well-being of the staff. And then, if I only had very little money in a company, I would invest it in the training of line managers. A bad line manager is why so many people take sick leave.
Very interesting indeed. Thank you very much. Now, Campbell, the photographs we've intermittently got up here, when I'm getting them working from time to time, speak back to a completely different era of housing poverty that Alan spoke about quite graphically, and these photos show even more graphically where, you know, the problem is clearly that you go inside these houses and they're damp and they don't have basic amenities. And in a way, 40, 50 years ago, this element of poverty was meant to be solved, and yet housing's been up and up, hasn't it, on the political agenda now for about 10 years. There's been a lot of talk since, I'd say, the late Brown government, but there isn't much of a sense of squalor, wasn't it? Beveridge's word. Yep. That giant seems to be alive and well.
I think that I think there's what the different elements of housing now which is different from everything else. I think that there are still some very small pockets of terrible, terrible accommodation. We still have people living in sheds in people's back gardens. We have people living in basements. We don't have a regime in this country which absolutely tackles the very worst end of the... We still have rogue landlords, as we did when Alan was living in Notting Hill all those years ago. They still exist. They're still there, but there's a smaller amount of people that live in them. The interesting thing, I think, about the housing crisis that we have now, and I think it plays out partly in the election that we've just seen from young people. We used to say a lot, I used to say to about 12 different housing ministers from 3 different parties over about 10 years. Do you know that people laugh at you when you talk about young people buying homes? You know that that you could not be further from the reality of most young people across the country. You know, there was a political class who believed that home ownership was the root out of everything. It was a job in your home and you were safe. And young people who were living in insecure accommodation with insecure jobs, with accommodation that cost too much, with landlords who could throw them out, whose jobs they could end every 6 months if they were lucky to get. They come out of university, they were lucky to get some sort of internship that paid them hardly anything, that was no prospects to do that kind of thing. The housing poverty was one of aspiration, of belief that it had changed around them. Combine that with a dearth of all political parties of building social housing, genuinely affordable. The Labour government was as bad at doing this as a Conservative government or the coalition. You combine those all together, and you have an inequality in the system which you have almost more than anywhere else. Those who have housing and those who don't, and the difference between those is enormous, is incredible. And I think that's why I think that it's, and then you link that to poverty, particularly in parts of the country where housing is just out of the reach of people. So that's why we absolutely passionately believe that the heart of any programme to change and eradicate poverty in this country has to come with a sustained approach to housing, because the other obvious link is this housing that is bad, is poor, leads to ill health. But it also leads to poor educational attainment. There are no children sharing rooms, have nowhere to do their homework. They have nowhere to play. They have nowhere to relax. They're more likely to see marital breakdown in stressful households as well. They're also more likely to be further away from their jobs, and they have to travel further, and they have to rely on public transport. So if you get housing right, you get so much more around it built. And I think that's why any long-term sustained approach to beating the type of poverty that we wish to see has to come with housing at the centre of it, and a very much sustained approach to it. It's not an easy thing to do, but you can do it.
I'm very grateful to you for making the point, particularly about homework, because I always... when you get people saying, oh, we're not going to worry so much about income poverty or material poverty anymore, we're going to worry about social mobility. You just need to think of the bright young kid trying to do their homework at home with a toddler running around or a telly blaring, and you just see that there can't be social mobility unless there's some measure of fairness in housing, I think. But
absolutely.
Let's bring in lots of the people who are here. People can put up their hands, and I know that there's a couple of people who've signalled to Chris and Saskia who've got the mics. Yeah, we've got one here at the front. And please, can people say who they are as well?
Good afternoon, thank you all. My name's Alec. I have several friends who are teachers, and...
Could you speak up just a little?
Yes, sorry. I have several friends who are teachers, and they say children can't learn if they're hungry, because all they can think about is their hunger. Is that the base of it all?
Can I start? I think that I'm going to ask your question in a roundabout way. One of the major problems that we face in this country is to be able to have a genuine discussion about what poverty actually means for people in this country. So if I take an example of hunger, we often, when we launched our big report on solving UK poverty, we did a lot of talk to people all across the country, all different classes and background. What do you do? Does poverty exist in this country? How do you solve it? Quite often people say, well, poverty doesn't exist here in the same way and does other places. People aren't starving, for example. About 18 months ago, some of the most well-meaning, most thoughtful, genuine people you could meet who run food banks across the country started to have a dialogue in this country about people who were starving in this country, people who were coming to them to seek food. And that didn't provoke a debate in this country about starvation on our streets or children coming up hungry, having had no breakfast and no lunch. It provoked an angry action that people, as Alan was describing, were skivers, were taking the mickey, weren't actually hungry. We didn't have the public policy agenda, the place, the space in this country to actually genuinely talk about these issues. So the first answer to the question is we have to absolutely begin to understand that people in this country are starving. There are children, if you go into schools across the country, they are starving. Breakfast clubs are full because children need that kind of thing. So I don't think it is the only problem, but it absolutely exists. But what we need to do is recognise it exists, talk about it more, be more open about it, and come up with policies that solve it.
Carol, do you want to chip on this one as well?
It's not just lack of food. I mean, one of the sort of follow-on effects is if children get very bad nutrition. And you know, sort of quick food, poorly nutritious. First of all, you're building up for them a series of ill health later on in life. And therefore, it has many more repercussions than are they just hungry. Their education will certainly be affected. So it has multiple effects moving forward.
Alan, do you want any chip in anything?
Well, we in Hull, we introduced free healthy school meals before Jamie Oliver, by the way. The only place they were doing it in the world was in Finland. And we introduced it in Hull, where we had particularly low educational attainment. We took it out of ordinary council funding. We didn't seek any help from anywhere. And it was monitored by Hull University. It was supposed to be a 5-year experiment. 3 years in, it wasn't an election winner, I have to tell you. It wasn't popular with the electorate. And 3 years in, we got dumped. The Lib Dem administration came in, ironically scrapped the scheme. We're now in part of the coalition, they introduced it as part of their policy, but they scrapped it in Hull. But the 3 years that we had with Hull University looking at this, it was breakfast and lunch, by the way, the results were remarkable, astounding in terms of educational attainment for primary school children. One of the difficulties was, of course, you can't compulsory. You remember that Jamie Oliver documentary when the parents were passing fish and chips through the school gates to make sure they had what they felt was the right nutritious meal. So there's an issue here about good parenting. We mentioned that in Sure Start, but also what Hull University found is these kids went home having had a nutritious, nice lunch and started to tell their parents, demand from their parents that they got it at home as well. And in a sense, the children started to educate the parents about what was healthy and what was nutritious. And it was amazing. And if we could recreate that, I mean, we had a stab at it in government in several locations under the Brown government. And the argument of the last election was, should it be lunches or should it be breakfast? Well, actually, it's a good argument for both. If you want to start off with breakfast, fine. But you're not going to do it on £2.20 a day, which is what the Tories were suggesting. £4.50 is more like it, if you want to do it properly, rather than just cutting costs, as it was to reduce the education budget in the Conservative manifesto.
Fantastic, thanks, Alan. Let's maybe take 3 questions at once so that we can divvy them out. So one there, yes, that's great, thanks.
Hi, I'm Claire Laxton. I am Assistant Director in a charity, but I've worked my whole career in the charity sector, including in a domestic abuse charity. And I think it's just been really interesting to hear thoughts from the panel on the differentiation between the state and the charity sector and what their responsibilities should be in terms of solving poverty and supporting people in poverty. I think particularly from sort of Campbell's point of view and Alan's point of view, having been on both of those sides.
Great, thank you very much. And then here, yep.
Hello?
Hello?
Yes, sorry, hello. Hi, this is in response to Dame Carol's reflections earlier. 2 points, really. One is based on sort of your own experience of providing a more holistic kind of approach to being a physician, and how actually a lot of the issues there is around professional risk aversion to seeing work as a health intervention, and how that's changing as a sort of a cultural or sort of norm within the world of physicians and what's being done now. I know there's the sort of work and health program that's going to address some of that, but those kind of programs can't get off the ground if you don't have people making the necessary referrals onto the right employment support agencies. And the second part of that is around creation of the jobs themselves. So I know you said a lot to what jobs should look like. They should be meaningful, they should have correct line management, and they should make people feel like they're giving a proper function in their lives. But of course, we need to have a job market that provides those kind of jobs, so it doesn't operate in its own kind of silo. And how do we make sure that we're creating those opportunities for people?
Great, thank you very much. And then we'll take one more just from the front here, and we'll come back to the other side of the room in another round.
Hi, my name is Vera. I'm just a member of the electorate, and I'm confused about the fact that when workers who are on the dole get a job, which turns out to be temporary, isn't there a delay before they get back into the benefit system, which really must act as a deterrent? It's not as if they're earning so much that they can tide themselves over. Or does the new universal credit obviate that?
Thank you. Carol, I think, yes, exactly. The question about the work as a health intervention, you're eminently the best person.
I mean, I think the only way we're going to start to get to grips with this, quite frankly, is through the education of all health professionals, because we've never had that in our education. It's been completely missing. And as you rightly say, people would really say, well, if you're not 100% fit, you shouldn't be in work. And to my shame, I would sit in clinic. I'm a rheumatologist with really severe rheumatoid arthritis. I can hear myself saying, well, it might be a lot easier if you didn't have to get to work. You've got a long journey. I was encouraging them into social isolation because I thought it was the right thing. I was taking the burden off them. It was rubbish. My job was to have done the things, maybe even have picked up the phone to their employer would have been a good start. Think about the Access to Work scheme, one of the government's best-kept secrets through DWP. It's a cultural and educational change. And if you want doctors and nurses to behave differently, I think you have to put it into their examinations. What gets examined gets considered. And so one of our big pushes has been to see if we could get the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges with its 21 colleges to start to think about how early in a career can you start to do this. And I believe very strongly that nurses could be a great advocate for this. They spend more time with patients than doctors, and very often a patient doesn't bother you with these things. They don't sit there and say to you, I'm longing to get back to work. What can you do to help? It's a whole cultural change. But give you a rather sad example. I hope we're able to change it. Early intervention is crucial. And we've been trying to replicate the Spanish experiment with very, very early referral for musculoskeletal problems at the first medical certificate. It was a referral in Spain into a rheumatology unit, but the return on investment of people being retained in work and also a financial return on investment was enormous. We're doing this experiment in Leeds with Paul Emery at the University of Leeds, and we decided it would be better if it was done by a GP, because we would hope the GPs would trust a GP, and it was a very well supported early intervention clinic. We need to get 1,450 patients or employees into this so that we can have some proper statistical analysis. After 1 year, GPs have only referred 89 individuals. Now, that is a huge barrier. And so just to give you an idea of the, I mean, we think with the CCG we're going to be able to get around this, but these things are not easy to change. But it is the beginning of the journey, and until we take ourselves in hand, I don't think we can ask the employers and all the other sectors to do their bit as well.
I'll just say a little word on Vera's question about the kind of fear of benefit being taken away if a job doesn't work out. I mean, it's a recurrent problem. There are lots of aspects like that in the benefit system. I think it's still true when you come out of prison, there's a kind of inadequate payment for a period, and then there's a long delay before you can get job seekers allowance, which is an invitation to go and steal a car radio if ever there was one. There's also, there's always a balance to be struck, because the government is always concerned with controlling public expenditure and not encouraging people to claim benefits lightly. But with the sanctions regime in the last few years, it's got, they've gone through the roof. They haven't just gone up a bit. They've gone up out of all proportion, and there's clear evidence of them being used as a kind of policy instrument. So there is a climate of fear, and some of the more successful interventions there's been, Alan and I were talking earlier about something called Pathways to Work, which is one of the early experiments on incapacity benefit reform, and one of the crucial things you had to do there is make sure that if someone tried a job and it didn't work out, because benefits change over the year, they had an absolute guarantee they could go straight back on the same terms that they were on before. So thinking about these things, not just, if you like, in the cross-section, in the snapshot, but how they follow through over time is often absolutely crucial, and very often, sometimes for penny-pinching reasons, and sometimes just because people aren't thinking things through, is very often not done, I would say. But now I want, first of all, Alan, why don't you have a word about, and then we'll bring Campbell in, on this balance between charities and the government. We don't hear quite so much about the big society at the moment.
And that's exactly what went through my mind. It's a great idea. It's called the big society, but nothing ever came of it. I mean, the fundamental idea there was that you get charities and government departments working closely together and all of that. And all that happened afterwards as a result of the mad dash to eradicate the fiscal deficit in one parliamentary term. You'll remember that was the driving force after 2010. Vainglorious, it was never going to happen. But the first casualty were the often very small amounts that local councils gave to charities, just almost peppercorn, that kept them going and that could get them match funding. So you saw charities going out of existence, which is why the big society hardly reared its head. If you get together, in my old constituency, if you got together a social enterprise which was called the Goodwin Centre, which was absolutely amazing. It provided nursery facilities, it provided transport, it provided all kinds of street wardens. If you get them together with the Prince's Trust, with the other local charities, and the local authority, and Job Centre Plus, and you get them all around the same table, and you say, look, how are we going to, for instance, increase the employment rate of 18 to 24-year-olds who couldn't get a job because they didn't have experience and couldn't get experience because they couldn't get a job? And they all work at it together. You can find the most remarkable ideas that come out from that. But it very rarely happens. So, that partnership idea is waiting for someone else to come up with the big society. But to do it fundamentally and to make it work. And the other point I want to make, just touched upon by Tom, the Department of Work and Pensions, in all of these areas that we've been talking about, whether it's benefits, whether it's poverty, it's the department with the biggest budget even bigger than health. Huge budget because of benefits. I was there for 7 months with Tom. We put into place this Pathways to Work, where incidentally we had people who were on incapacity benefit, which had gone up from 700,000 to 2.7 million between 1979 and 1997. As workers left the steel yards and the shipyards and coal mines, they were encouraged to go on incapacity benefit. And so it had gone up and was going up to a rate that would have hit 4 million by the middle of the last decade. And Pathways to Work, which we introduced, which said for people who'd been on incapacity benefit for a year, come in and we'll give you some therapy, musculoskeletal, some help with psychological therapies. Lots of it was mental health issues. and get you back into work. We changed the law, as Tom just described, so that if it didn't work out, they went straight back on incapacity benefit. We had people breaking down our doors in Strathclyde, in Merseyside, where this was, you know, this idea that they wanted to be watching daytime television on 72 quid a week. They were desperate to access this help to get them back to work. And if we could have had a consistent approach to that, instead of chopping and changing work and pensions secretaries, we had about 10, and we've just figured out there's been 4 since 2015. There's a new one now. There's no consistency in government's approach to this. And of course, I think, you know, the idea of going off into universal credit, which is what's taking up everybody's attention there now. If you plan this through properly, you do it with the voluntary sector and a charitable sector, you can really start to make some progress on these ideas. And it doesn't cost an awful lot of money. It needs some investment in it as well, but the returns would be dramatic.
Campbell. I'll be very brief. Let me very briefly on state, poverty and charity. I think actually the way that it has to work is when I've seen the state do it on its own, it doesn't work. I've seen charity doing it on, it doesn't work on its own when they work together. But also I would add into that list the private sector. I think increasingly both neither the state nor the charitable sector recognise the huge role that the private sector has, because what I was going to talk about is part of the problem that we have now is that Economics 101 that we've all been taught since the start of the end of the Second World War, the new economic boom, is that work was the best route out of poverty. And it's still in principle true that that is the case. However, for most people, this is the second or third job that they need to get them out of poverty now, or the type of job that they get. And what I think needs to happen relating to the question about work and how work changes and how we need to do that is that we have to have a new way of building growth in our economies, in our local economies, in our national economies, in our regional economies. Because just to give you a story, I was in Sunderland recently, and a great city of the, you know, and sort of massively, and I was there 5 years ago, was still thriving. I was there about a year and a half ago in the city centre, and it was dying. There's nothing but pound shops and charity shops and hardly anything else. And their hope for the revitalisation of Sunderland city centre was a very well-known sports chain, whose name I won't mention. There are many sports chains available. Some of them employ their people well, some of them don't employ them so well. But their hope for economic, social regeneration was them opening a store in this town. If you rely on that type of employer for the health and well-being of your staff, to build economic growth, to take people on a journey, to give them skills and education to do that, that's not the answer. We have to have a partnership between the public sector, the private sector, and the state in each place to build up new types of businesses that can really support. Just to give there are businesses that are doing this massive. IKEA just became a living wage employer in the United Kingdom. It's a huge thing. They had to give thousands of their workers a pay rise to do that. For them to take their shareholders, to take their things, they are committed to becoming an employer. And that's about health, that's about well-being, and that's about recognising, wanting a workforce that stays in their jobs and feels fulfilled in life. So when I see that not one answer, the state, the charitable sector, nor the private sector has the answer to poverty, when they work together to really, really understand what they can do for their workforce and take people on their journey, then the answer for Sunderland isn't a sports chain that will, you know, kind of give somebody some low-wage work and some cheap Adidas.
Of course.
A cheap Adidas is excellent, but, you know, obviously. But,
I wonder if we should ask Michael.
Yes. Well, has he got a question? Michael?
I think, Michael, you could add to this debate. I mean, surely it's been your passion as well as mine. I just think you had sort of so much to say.
I had a comment on every question and comment that's been made so far. Firstly, I'm Michael Marmot, by the way, and I need to confess the British Medical Journal does this silly thing with doctors, and they ask you a question, and one of the questions they say, who, Lansley or Bevan, who was the worst and who was the best health secretary? And I said, I have a dog in this fight. The best was Alan Johnson, because he commissioned me to do a review of health inequalities. And I said, the worst, it's such a crowded field, it's too hard to choose. I think, as I've been struggling with these issues of poverty. And 2 points. One, as Alan knows well, because he commissioned me to do this review, I tried to say, important as poverty is, because of the social gradient in health, I don't want simply to find the people who are below some line and the ones who are just above that line. In fact, the further you are above the line, the better off you are. And a lot of what Carol is talking about is people in work or trying to get into work who may not meet the definition of poverty. So the social gradient links the very poor, people below the line, with the fact that the worse you are down that hierarchy, the worse your health, and it correlates with a lot of other things.
So you're describing a slope that means it's really a question about inequality as a whole rather than just poverty at the bottom, is that right?
Well, so for example, take Theresa May's just about managing. If they're the 20th to the 50th centile of income, what we know is if you're at the 50th centile of income, your health is better than if you're at the 20th centile, and everywhere in between. If you're at the 20th centile, your health is better than if you're below that. And in fact, it goes above the 50th centile, all the way up to the top. And so I think we need to link improving society with addressing poverty, and the two, not to separate them, to bring them together. And what's on my mind very much, given that I think the mind is an important gateway by which social determinants impact health, what we've seen over the last 7 years is depriving the poor of their dignity, of actually blaming them for their poverty, of having an uncaring system, the default position of which is that you are a skiver, that you don't deserve what you get, and so on and so on. And that means that we have to have a fundamental shift. We need policies that, as Alan says, you could spend 11 billion breaking the freezing of child benefits and the like. But we need a fundamental shift that the poor are not the architects of their own misfortune. We are the architects of their misfortune, and we should not be blaming them for their poverty. We should not be putting in place an uncaring system that makes life worse. And what we know from our studies across Europe is that the more generous the welfare system, the narrower the health inequalities, and the lower the unemployment level. So the whole idea that you have to have miserly benefit systems in order to drive people back into work isn't true when you look across Europe, because it relates to Carol's concern. What we also see is the countries that have more generous benefit systems tend to have better psychosocial working conditions. So people want to get back into work because it's positive. So underlying what I'm saying, the gradient dealing with our attitudes to society, because I think, Alan, if I'm not misquoting you, you said poverty is powerlessness, and that's grist to my mill. We need to empower people, and we can take proper social action, but we've got to get our attitudes right.
Thank you very, very much indeed for that expert contribution from the floor. Now, we really are nearly at time. Don't panic, because when we've finished, we can go and continue the conversation to the right, where we'll be able to have a drink and continue the conversation with a drink in our hand. But we've got just 1 minute, and I saw a chap there just put up his... Oh, yeah, sorry, yeah. Let's just take this one last question, and then you can come and grab us over a drink at the end. Yes.
Hi, I'm Simon. I just wanted to ask, as a son of refugees, just this linking between poverty and anti-immigration, and, you know, the people are coming, a lot of people on, you know, who are on in-work poverty blaming refugees for their problems. Is this a dangerous phenomenon that needs to be addressed?
Thank you very much. And actually that links out of some of what Michael was saying as well, in terms of the blame game poverty and maybe the blame game in particular is directed towards minorities. There was really, genuinely, a programme on Channel 5 called Gypsies on Benefits and Proud, if you thought Benefit Street was enough. Let me give each of you a chance to say something, any final word you like, and particularly on this question, maybe, of the blame game, before we'll have to wrap up. Alan, first of all.
One of those photos that I, because of my lack of competence with new technology, couldn't get on there consistently, but there's one.
It's not that new anymore.
Is that right? Okay. I thought an iPad was a bit of cotton wool you put over your eye if it was. One of those photographs was an amazing photograph that Roger Main captured in 1955 of 4 West Indian men walking into Southam Street, and the kids in the gutter looking up, the teddy boys sort of waiting for them to pass. This was pre the Notting Hill race riots. These West Indian men usually came over by themselves without their families initially. They came to the motherland that they saw in the Commonwealth, and more recently had just been the Empire, to come and drive our buses, deliver our posts, push our hospital trolleys, because we went out and said we're desperate, we had full employment in this country. And there they were walking into Southam Street, probably to a Rackman flat, because there was one down the bottom end of Southam Street, the notorious gangster landlord. And the photograph captures the clash of cultures, the West Indian men with their hats, their fabulous coloured shirts, and the wary local population. Now, you know, this has been replicated time and time again. Oswald Mosley came out of retirement, the fascist who'd been imprisoned during the war and then exiled to France, came out of retirement to fight the North Kensington election in 1959 because he thought he could exploit this tension between the local population and the immigrants who had come into their community. He lost his deposit, I'm pleased to say, but ever since, it's been another wave of immigrants where this has happened. Now, thankfully, you know, some of the protection against the terrible discrimination has been addressed over the years. Now we find it's not even an issue of colour. It's Eastern Europeans who are now the new kind of whipping boy, if you like. But it's what happens when politicians exploit the tensions that exist in a deprived community and seek to turn the blame for that deprivation on a group of immigrants. Now, you would have thought we'd have become immune to it now. It's happened so many times, but it still is a factor. And I think you raise a very important point about refugees now. People used to tell me in my constituency that they all got off the state, got a new car, got a suit, I've lost account of the number of things that they are supposed to get free of charge. Whereas, of course, their position is extremely perilous. So it is still a factor in this. I like to think we've moved on and we've improved society as we have in many degrees, but still that becomes a potent political force by those who want to wield it.
Thank you very much indeed, Alan. And now, Carol?
I just really want to pick up and re-emphasise what Michael's has said about we're the architects of those who are not in work. I'll give you a very practical example in this report that I've done on addiction and the benefit system, and it picks up on prisons. What addicts said to me, that wherever they were in their awful position, the 4 things they wanted was a roof over their heads, a job, but not any old job, a partner, and if possible, children. And yet, we, by the systems we have created, leave them at a prison door with no money. Of course, they haven't got a passport or a driving license. And as one woman said to me, who I visited in one of our female prisons, well, I'm going out next week and my pimp will be at the end of the road and I will be back on the job. I think it does come down to being a really uncaring society. And I didn't pick up particularly on the benefit system, but I've spent a year and a bit studying it. And you have to know that in the way it's designed, in my opinion, for so many people, it is a car crash. It is a car crash. It doesn't need to be that way, by the way. It really doesn't need to be that way. And, you know, I would like to have a go at reforming it.
I vote for you as the next Secretary of State for Welfare Reform. All those who say aye, aye. There we go. Passed is the motion. Dame Carol Black is the new Secretary of State for Welfare. There's a right shuffle still going on, I think, isn't there? I suppose the thing I wanted to say, which picks up the point about refugees and everything else, is that it's partly we have a society of our own making. It is our choice and our choices that make that. And I think that the thing that I was trying to say at the beginning is that once you take away hope from people, once you make them struggle all the time, once you make life about the day-to-day, about just getting your rent paid or getting your kids to school or finding enough money for lunch, or your kids got a hole in their shoes and you're worried about it, and you've got to pay the gas and you've got to pay the electricity and you see it every day in communities all over the country. If that is your life, and you can find someone to blame, and that you're given an outlet for that anger and that frustration that you can't provide for yourself, for your family in the way that you want to do, it is a reaction that is not the one that we want to see, but it's because we haven't given people that choice, those opportunities, those chances for their children to thrive, for their communities to grow, for them to have decent houses. The reason that people are worried about people getting a house is because there is a scarcity of decent houses that people can afford. Build some houses that everybody can afford, and then we can all have an opportunity to get a decent house. I absolutely believe that a comprehensive plan to take communities and people out of poverty will start to solve so many of the problems, the inequalities we see in health, the attitudes towards refugees and migrants that we see, the types of attitudes that we've seen all across the time. It is absolutely essential that this generation is standing still. It's starting to go backwards. And if we do not give them the opportunity to grow and to develop and to become the people in the communities they want to be, then we will get what we deserve, which is where communities are divided, who blame, who are angry. And we have a choice as a community, as policymakers, as public, private sector, as government itself, to make that choice and to do that. And can I just say before I finish, because I know Tom's going to do this, can I just say to Alan, thank you for everything you've done. You've been an inspiration to many of us for many, many years, for telling the stories that you've told, to tell them in the way that you've done it. So thank you for everything you've done. You're a great loss to politics, but a great victory for literacy and literature.
And I'll just butt in and finally wrap up. I thank you first of all to everyone for coming and packing this wonderful hall, and thanks to Carol for bringing such authority and expertise into the discussion, to Campbell for, in Alan's phrase, deploying the muscular practicality, I think it was, of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. It's been like that for a long time, and all of us who care about and follow these issues, as Prospect magazine does and will continue to do, always know that Joseph Rowntree is the place to go for to get this kind of information. And then, of course, special thanks again to Alan Johnson. I won't simply parrot what Campbell said, but I think that, like, one last shot maybe for these photographs, we can see sometimes doing what Alan's done for us tonight by taking a longer view, because we have had 7 very lean years where there's been some good intentions, sometimes some not very nice intentions and some blame. But we've had 7 lean years that were going to hurt whoever was in charge, and they were going to hurt the vulnerable. Now maybe that is moving, and Theresa May saying austerity is finished. And now when we look back half a century or so to this kind of thing, we can see that in the end, even if it hasn't felt like it in these 7 lean years, there can be progress and things can get better. So thank you, Alan, above all, for reminding us of that. Alan's book, charting his long and winding road from Southern Street, as I say, to High Office, I think is on sale at the back. We've also got drinks through on the right-hand side. My right-hand side, your left-hand side, I think. And we'll all be hanging around to continue the conversation with a glass of wine in our hands. So thanks very much indeed. that all right from your point of view? Good. And thanks for doing it.